Chris's weapon serves as one of the more readily available weapons in the game. This is, of course, because it's available through the Fiery Crystal Mines and was since the very start of the event. So people have naturally built up a lot of fragments for it, and of course, it's purchasable every fortnight through the Fiery Crystal shop as well. So all players, paid players, free-to-play players alike, should, at minimum, realistically, have Chris's weapon starting to get to 1, 2, perhaps even more stars. And typically, for most mid-spender or above players, his weapon has normally served as a stat funneler into other commanders because, of course, Chris is a lower priority commander. So here, for example, I have my Chris weapon on Patello rather than on Chris himself. But just like all my weapon videos, I'm going to go into the effect his weapon will have on his awakening skill. And the question will be, can you push Chris to a point where he himself, with his weapon equipped, becomes a competitive commander? Of course, at the very, very top levels, that will always be impossible. But perhaps for mid-spender players who do have paid alternatives to him, so say like Lats at gold or Andrea at gold, maybe you can push him to a point where he is actually usable. So the way I've formatted this, rather than my Discord text channels, is actually write out in a spreadsheet all the effects of his weapon. So of course the way Chris's weapon, or Chris's awakening effect itself works is when you lose every 5% of your total amount of infantry troops that are participating in a fight, you will gain this amount in this top row as infantry defense. So of course every 5% that then gets multiplied, and it'll continue doing that until of course all your infantry are effectively dead. So you can see from his base awakening here, the stars on his weapon do very significantly increase this awakening effect, going from 60% there at the top end all the way to 300% at the 4-star weapon. Of course, at this point, if you ever reach this number, all your infantry are dead. So this bottom column is effectively irrelevant because of that, and that's something we're going to have to take into account here, because the uptime of his awakening effect is actually what we're going to want to be looking at if we're going to try and assign an average defense value to this effect and then compare it to other options. Because, of course, even if you hit, say, this 95% loss part of his ability, you're only hitting that very, very late in the fight. So if you're going to put an average value to it, you're probably going to want to about half these values according to whatever you top off at in a fight. So if we're thinking of realistic scenarios and accounting for uptime, we're probably going to want to be operating about within this territory. If you're topping off at about 40 to 80% loss, I guess you can maybe stretch it down to here as well. If you're having everything eliminated, particularly if you're running multiple lines, I would say this is the range we're going to want to be using to apply an average defense value to his awakening ability. Now, as I've previously mentioned, the point of this video is going to be asking the question of, can we make Chris into a viable option in competitive PvP setups? So if I scroll down a bit, here I have Chris's stats here, and below this is Andrea. So if you compare the two, Andrea has 8% higher infantry attack and health, and then 58% higher infantry defense. So she has a total of 74% more infantry stats. 16% of that is health and attack, so I'd say it's about 80% effective infantry defense, is just a rough approximation. Then, of course, you have her awakening ability as well. Realistically, if you're looking to run Chris or Andrea, you're probably going to be mono-inf. And the way Andrea's ability here works is that it goes off proportions. So if you have 100% infantry units, you can only gain the infantry defense part. If it's actually equal in terms of proportions, you'll get nothing. But if you're running mono-imp, it's impossible to get the infantry attack, even if you have less actual units participating. If 100% of your troops are infantry, you cannot get that 30% attack. If you're running, say, Spear Inf or Imp Spear weakness, it would be possible, but for most practical situations, you're going to be getting that 30% infantry defense. So if we total up all these differences, we're going to want somewhere in the region of about 100% to 110% infantry defense to make Chris have equivalent value to a 4-star Andrea. Andrea's weapon is very annoying to get and not very good either. So we'll just assume that in both scenarios you're moving Chris's weapon between the two, assuming it has decent base attack on it, which is quite a common scenario. So we're going to want to be looking for that 100 to 110% range in that grouping that we were looking for earlier. And you can see you start to approach that quite consistently at the 3 to 4-star weapon range, mostly the 4-star weapon point. I would say that theoretically, Chris with his 4-star weapon equipped is approximately equivalent in value as Andrea with that same weapon equipped onto her. And if you're running, say, mid-spender bleed, and you've got Sonara, Rhea, Kevin, Lats, and then you want that last spot filled, I do think it may actually make a lot of sense when you get to that 4-star weapon point to actually just run Chris in that 5th slot, because you've got to remember, of course, you need the weapon equipped to the respective commander to gain the 5,000 army size part of this. See Chris apply immediately when equipped. So this doesn't actually apply as soon as the weapon hits 4-star. It has to be equipped to Chris. So if the scenario here is this weapon is either on Andrea or on Chris, you'd effectively be gaining 5,000 army size at this point as well. Of course, a 4-star Chris weapon at this point is quite unrealistic for most people. It's quite far in the future, but it can be something for lower spending players to potentially aim for and look to grind towards. And even if not, for lower spending players, this can, at worst, be quite validating that Chris with weapon is actually a pretty good option. When you start getting to that 2-star weapon range and then up, he's actually very, very solid and probably doesn't get the respect, it's quite a weird way of phrasing it, that he deserves, just because he's such a basic and readily available commander. But when you actually do the maths, as you can see, he can actually be a very, very solid pick in these mono infantry setups. You can run him with infantry weakness, you can run him with inf spear weakness, spear inf weakness, inf bleed, or even just, of course, totally free to play formations where you can't actually access synergy because you can't get the epic tokens or the commander medals to actually gold out any of those synergy enablers and Jamie or Sonara as well.